Hey, I recall Central Park in fall. I feel like I've done that. But years of watching Ferris Bueller's Day Off, whenever I pick up a microphone, that's always the first thing. Even though he doesn't do it into a microphone, he does it, in fact, into a shower head. Welcome to my Ferris Bueller podcast. In a one, and a two, and a 1, 2, 3, 4. Do 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 do. Beep bop beep boop bop bee. It's Wednesday, and I need to. Excuse me while I clear. Let me clear my throat. Mana 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 mana. Oh! God damn. Okay, so. Today is Wednesday the 13th, and here are some funny books. Wait, there's no Marvel comics in here? No, I also read indie comics. I don't know, I get very defensive about that sort of thing. I'll tell this story. It always has seemed to me that in comic book fandom, certainly since before I was born, but there's long been, I want to say going back to the underground era of the mid to late 60s, a wide divide in comic book fandom between people who read superhero comics and people who read independently produced comics. What constitutes independently produced, that's been blurred considerably over the last 30 years by Image Comics, which started out as very much just a superhero comic book publisher and is now the biggest and probably the most successful independent comic book publisher ever. I digress. And to me, that's always been honestly always just been a very silly divide. I really do enjoy superheroes quite a bit. I do feel, and this has been pointed out millions of times, but superhero representation in comics is ridiculous. Warren Ellis used to liken it to walking into a bookstore and being able to find nothing but books on nursing. That was all they would have. And then maybe in the corner they'd have fiction. That's what superhero comics are when you walk into a comic book store, just like that. Unless you happen to walk into my comic book store, which does have a lot of superhero stuff, but we have a lot of other stuff as well. But this particular divide between the two, when it comes to my own personal struggles, I can trace it back, oddly enough, to an art school girl. As most of my woes and troubles can be traced. When I feel like I might have told this story. Again, I don't care. The year was 1994, and I was either 16 or about to turn 16. Yeah. Or no, I was 16 about to turn 17. That's right. And it was Comic-Con time. As every year for my birthday, the world would get together and have the San Diego Comic Book Convention. It was always right around my birthday. And at this age, now I'm a stately upperclassman in high school. But really as soon as I started collecting comics, the first comics I bought were 2 Uncle Scrooge comics, 2 issues of Gru the Wanderer, and an issue of the Uncanny X-Men. And that was like, I was still way more into the cartoony stuff than the superhero stuff. And then immediately, on top of all the Marvel comics I was buying Ralph Snart Adventures. I started reading Hate, anything I could get my hands on by Peter Bagg. And then eventually, by the time I was 16 or 17, I was reading a lot of Fantagraphics, a lot of underground or alternative press stuff, as we called it then. But I was still very enamored of superheroes. I was reading fewer and fewer superhero comics around that time because A, they were really bad, and B, I was starting to spend more money on records and going out and stuff too. So I just, I wanted to buy stuff that was more interesting. Anyway, so here I am, I'm 17 years old, and I'm walking around Comic-Con by myself, and I stop at this one booth, which is one of your arty or fartier booths. Would probably not even be a booth now, but a table at Artist Alley. But it was a booth. I want to say, I couldn't tell you for what publisher. Last Gasp, maybe. You know what? I don't want to say because I don't want to. It doesn't matter. It's a 30-year-old story. I'm telling. So I'm looking at the artsiness. You know, they had prints and stuff. I don't think they even had any comics. I was just looking at the art. And as I was doing so, there was a very severe young art school girl working this booth. Little older than me, even. And we were both ignoring each other. And then, up walk 3 small boys. 9, 10, no, probably a little bit older. 11 or 12. And, I'll never forget this as long as I live. There were 3 of them. The one who had apparently been elected spokesperson stepped forward. He was wearing a baseball cap, so you could tell. But he was... I've never seen anybody so nervous in my life, and I own several mirrors. He's just shaking. He was holding his program, little Comic-Con program, and it was the newsprint is rattling in his hands. And all he knew as a 12-year-old boy, 11-year-old boy, was that when you were lost or looking for something, you asked an older person. I didn't look that much older at that age, so he elected to add. Plus, she was working the booth, so she was clearly someone in authority. So these boys were really just being respectful of her position. And this kid, I'm just, but I see this whole thing play out right in front of me. And this kid, can you tell us where the Valiant Comics booth is? And Valiant Comics at the time, especially, were publishers. Valiant Comics was a publisher of, at the time especially, some of the dumbest, stupidest superhero comics that had ever been published. Real eyesores, real stuff I read now, ironically. It's Jim Shooter's thing. I'm sure I've mentioned it. But I mean, my point is, they couldn't have picked a more incorrect booth to ask about Valiant Comics. And this beautiful little art school girl just goes like this. She goes, I don't know. And boy, I turned to look at these kids, and they were dust clouds in the shape of these kids. And I didn't say or do anything, as is my preferred method of doing things. But I looked at this lady, and I was just like, you know what? I do kind of wish I had said something. Just for no other reason, because it's been bothering me for the last 30 years. But I wanted to say to her, and not even angrily. I just wanted to say it, and there was no way, especially at that age, that I could have said it without sounding pretentious. But I really wish I would have been able, if I could go back and just take her aside and go, listen, I get it. These kids are a pain in the ass, right? And you don't care about superheroes, and why should you? You're a rational person. But if you'll notice, the only other person in this booth is a boy not much older than these boys who knows exactly where the Valiant Comics booth was, and probably would have told him if they hadn't run away. And would have been in that. I was like, I could immediately empathize with those kids. I was closer to those kids than I was to this art student. But I go, I'm here now. I care. You're gonna, these kids, those kids probably never read a comic book again. And not because of that incident. They probably went home and grew up, and like most boys, grew out of it. Until all these Marvel movies came out anyway. Now they're taking their kids to it and go, I used to go to Comic-Con. The divide between superhero comic fandom and alternative press comic book fandom, ridiculous. I have a dear friend who I used to work with at the comic book store, who I became friends with at the comic book store that I used to work at in San Diego. He doesn't read any superhero comics, and we butt heads on that particular. But he's never a dick about it. He might be, but he was never a dick to me about it. Anyway, I got 3 indie books here to talk about. It's a little anecdote to start off the show. He says. All right, first up, something I have never seen until it popped up today. This is Santos Sisters #1. This is actually the second printing. And according to my very, very quick research, this was originally a self-published comic by the creators, whose names elude me, who I believe are siblings, although these could just be fake names too. Written and drawn by Fake and Greg Peter, which makes me think if the guy's name is Fake or a woman. But regardless, it is now being distributed by Floating World, which is one of my favorite indie publishers, and I haven't thought of in forever. I don't even know why Warren ordered this, but this just looks like a parody of Archie comics and 90s superhero comics. So I was like, oh yeah, I will take this. And I don't know anything else beyond it, beyond just and I could tell from looking at it. It also says, finally a comic for Generation X. Why, that's me. Born in 1977. Some may argue I'm on the cusp. I say I had to put up with just as much Jay McInerney praise as anyone else back then. Also today, I bought Statics #1. This is from Fantagraphics, which is, until Image, was probably the biggest and most successful indie comics publisher, especially because they didn't publish any superhero stuff. Now, in the 90s was really their heyday, or at least that was when I was paying the most attention. It wasn't long after that they really leaned more into the sort of historical side and did a lot of reprints of like classic old like Popeye comic strips from 100 years ago, and they did a lot of EC comics reprints from the 50s. So they got really and they also, Fantagraphics published the Comics Journal, which when I was a kid was a monthly magazine and the last word in serious sequential art. And then it continued to be so, I think, up until it ceased publication not that long ago. But Fantagraphics is still in business, and they still put out new stuff. I don't have my finger on the pulse like I used to. Again, very quick Google search reveals that Jeffrey Lewis here is primarily known as a musician for the last 20 years, and part of what they call the anti-folk movement, which I can't tell if I hate more than folk music. And I hate folk music already. But an anti-folk movement does not sound any more appealing. In fact, it sounds worse. But this is, right here, I don't know if you can see it, this is a reference to a song by the Painted Ship called Frustration. That's a very deep garage rock cut. So I'm like, oh, I didn't see this until just like a few minutes ago. I bought this because it's on Fantagraphics and it looked interesting. But then there's a Painted Ship reference on the cover, so that's a no-brainer right there. And then finally, star of the show, what I couldn't do without, which I'm definitely going to read, perhaps even tonight. This is the 4th book in the Reckless series called The Ghost in You. This is, of course, a series of books by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, who have done many comics together, mostly in the crime genre. And even the ones that aren't in the crime genre definitely hover close to it. So this is the 4th, like I said, the 4th one. Oh, they got another blurb from Patton Oswalt. And also one from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, star of the 1980 film Airplane. So this one takes place in '89, which makes me think it's towards the end, because every one of these books have been in the '80s. Maybe they'll go into the '90s, because if I recall correctly, it was the last book where we kind of got a glimpse of Reckless now. The basic conceit of these books is that Reckless is the guy, I can't remember his first name, but he's kind of like the Equalizer, if you ever watched that old show. He's not a licensed private investigator. He's not a cop. I think he used to be an FBI agent many lifetimes ago, I believe. But he owns and lives in a rundown movie theater in Los Angeles, California, and he gets all business by word of mouth. So people come to him, they have a thing they need done, some kind of detective work usually, and they don't want to go to the cops, so they can't afford a private eye, so they come to him, and if he wants to take the case, he will. And obviously he meets with a lot of adventures. And he narrates the stories. They all take place in the 80s, as I've said. The first one was in 1981. This is in 89, so fill it in between. But at the end of the last one, we get a glimpse of him in the present. And so I took that, hopefully, to mean that they were going to do books all the way through his 40 years from the beginning. I doubt that they're going to do that many, but I hope the 90s are at least on the table, because I would like to see, the 90s are getting used more and more often, especially as people my age continue to grow old and have the nostalgia market aimed at them. But I would really like to see some 90s noir. 80s noir definitely has a flavor to it. It's if you've ever seen the film Drive with Ryan Gosling, is a perfect example. These books are a perfect example. I want to say there's at least one more to make a pattern. I can't pull it. But, really, well, speaking of the film Drive, is directed by Nicholas Winding Refn. Huge tribute to Michael Mann films of the 80s. So I would consider those movies like Thief and Thief. What else did Mann do in the 80s? Well, Miami Vice, for example. There's a movie I'm trying to think of from the 80s. Heat was probably Michael Mann's biggest movie, but that was from the 90s. Anyway. I love Brubaker and Phillips, have done since their first collaboration, which was called Sleeper, from the early 2000s. And I've read everything they've done since. Did I read The Fade Out? I think The Fade Out might be the last thing, but I think I did finally read that during quarantine. Regardless, Reckless is my favorite. It's unbelievably good. The only thing that even comes close for me with Brubaker and Phillips is, and I think I've mentioned this before too, but one of the final arcs of the book Criminal, which is probably their main thing over the last 20 years. That's like the definitely the big one. So the final arc, which was called Last of the Innocents, was an analog for Riverdale, the Archie gang, before that show was a thing. And at the time, so this was like 10, 15, maybe not that long ago. No, yeah, I guess about 10 or 12 years ago. And I was blown away. So that is what we like to call around here is Picks of the Week. Now, ba-da-ba-dee-ba-doo. I really ate up some time with that anecdote at the top, didn't I? Well, you know what? When it's your show, you can do whatever you want. So I had a month's worth of comics to read. And now I don't even remember which ones I talked about at the top. Oh, okay. Here we go. I'm probably going to have to open some of these and remind myself of why. It doesn't matter. First up, Astro City. That was then special. This is exactly what I had hoped for. We have the Jayhawks, who are a kind of a Teen Titans-y team, and they go missing, presumed dead. And so their colleagues, who are also teenage superheroes, it's very much a Summer of 64 type thing, or Summer of 42, whatever that movie was. Summer of 69, where we have these teen heroes, and it's very Silver Agey. And then, as often happens in Astro City, reality comes crashing in. You're like, oh, well, now these guys are dead. So they just kind of are like, we need to up and take off. And they just kind of go on a road trip and figure out. It's very much a good place for the new arc of Astro City to stop, because it's superpowers. And the great thing about, this is something about Astro City too, is that the superhero-y stuff is not the primary concern. It's really more a character study of superheroes, what these people might actually act like. They're not realistic and dark and gritty, but they're not as cartoony as like superheroes are. It's a very idealized, really essentially just the Marvel/DC universe as seen through Busiek and Anderson's eyes. And that's the appeal, because they have a great love and reverence for this genre, and it shows in every panel. So yeah, it wasn't like action-packed, but a lot of Astro City is not action-packed. But it was a really good, we're going to be delving into some psychological stuff here. When it comes to people who dress up in long underwear and hit each other, psychology is really what you want to know about. I also read Magic Order 2, number 6. This was super fun. And basically what I was saying last week is like, I don't remember any of these characters' names or really whatever happened in the first issue. All I know is bad magicians versus good magicians. And there's a big, like, Cthulhu-ish god. So, yeah, it's great. And Imminent, is it Imminent? Yeah. Imminent is still, really, I think Imminent's only ever gotten better. Like, I run across Next Wave. I have the whole run of Next Wave, which was a book that Stuart Imminent did with Warren Ellis back in, like, 05, 06, I want to say. Maybe 07 even. And, great stuff, but he's only gotten better. So, yeah, and like a very Mark Millar, there's a lot of swearing, there's a lot of violence, which is all, absolutely. That's the other thing, too. Whenever I feel like I need to defend Mark Millar, he writes really violent stuff. That's great. If you don't like violent stuff, that's fine. But I do. And then, of course, there's a happy ending. And I guess we'll see if this TV show ever goes. Is there an ad for the... Yeah. July 2022 will be the Magic Order 3. So, sounds good to me. I enjoy the book, despite the fact that I can't remember any characters' names ever. Alright, what else did I read? I want to burn through this, but also I need to get my clothes out of the dryer, and also I'm hungry. Okay, I'm going to go in this order. Okay. So also last week, I read SpiderGwen, Gwenverse #1. This is... the whole Gwen Stacy phenomenon in Marvel Comics has really caught up to me, and I'm totally fine with it. This is written by Tim Seeley, who's largely known for his book called Hack Slash, and he also wrote a book. I didn't read Hack Slash, but he did a book called Revival, which I did read at least the first couple years worth, that I really liked. So, quick thumbnail: Gwen Stacy in Marvel lore was Peter Parker's college girlfriend who was famously killed by the Green Goblin, or famously killed in an altercation with the Green Goblin. He throws her off the top of the George Washington Bridge. Spider-Man, in an attempt to escape Spider-Man, he throws Gwen off the bridge and takes off. Spidey opts to save her. He shoots his web at her and grabs her before she can fall any further, but then she's already dead. And the implication is you're like, oh, did she die from shock, or did she die because when he grabs her with the web, I think there's like a snap sound effect or something, so it's kind of implied that he might have accidentally killed her. And then that became like another sort of Uncle Ben moment. It reaffirmed, and it's a very famous book. It was a very famous, within fandom, people were livid. And it was written by Jerry Conway, who at the time I don't even think could buy alcohol. They'd given him the book after Roy Thomas, right? Or after... No, it wouldn't have been right after Stan, I don't think. Maybe it was? I don't remember who took over after Stan. If it was Thomas or Conway. But regardless, Conway caught a lot of shit for it. People were livid. And I've always loved Gwen. And even though I like Peter and Mary Jane together, I've always considered Gwen to be his one true love. Really and for true. So what we have here is obviously a very much similar to the Spider-Verse. Well, I don't know how obvious it is. Oh, right. So I should mention that. So, for many years, Gwen Stacy, like I say, was considered to be sort of like an Uncle Ben character. Which is to say, a character that has to die in order for our hero to grow as a hero. And part of that deal is they're not allowed to come back. And so, they've never... in superhero comics are famous for bringing back dead characters. But there's certain characters you just couldn't bring back. At least not for good. Uncle Ben has come back to life a couple times, or we've seen other alternative realities. Ed Brubaker really put paid to this theory about 10 years ago when he brought Bucky, the Winter Soldier, back. Bucky had been Captain America's sidekick, who had died during World War II. Come to find out, he's actually the Winter Soldier. So Brubaker thought of a way around that. and now Marvel as on a whole has. So Gwen can never come back. Gwen Stacy has shown up in things since she died, but either as a clone or as a ghost or something like that. But then a few years back, let me see if I remember this right. I'm again probably gonna have to correct myself in the comments, but there was a series of variants, and this happened with. You know what? I don't remember. I actually no. You know what? I think SpiderGwen came out. Yeah, that's right. So Spider-Verse. Sorry, I'm collecting my thoughts. Spider-Verse was a storyline where there's multiple universes, obviously, and there's a Spider-Man in each one, and they're being wiped out. A lot of Marvel events these days start like this. And in one particular reality, instead of Peter Parker getting bitten by a radioactive spider, Gwen Stacy actually gets bitten by a radioactive spider. And then her Peter Parker goes crazy and dies. Started out just as a minor character in that event, but proved so popular that she is now the focus of her own sort of Spider-Verse. And this character, this Gwen Stacy from Earth 66, I think is her Earth, is, I just realized it's 616 without the one. They gave her own title and everything, and so she's had her own like monthly title for a very long time. First it was called SpiderGwen, and then Radioactive SpiderGwen, and then that more recently changed to Ghost Spider, because it doesn't make sense for her name to be SpiderGwen in the comics itself. And in the comics itself, she still lives in her own universe where she and her father are both very much alive, but she goes to college in the 616 universe. I guess she couldn't test into any college in her own universe. So they really keeping her in here. And I just thought it was fun. I'm going to skip over a lot of these because there's only really one that I really want to talk about, speaking of spiders, and that's SpiderPunk. This is another character to come out of the Spider-Verse storyline. This is Hobie Brown and Earth 138, which is a Misfits reference. I love how many references there are to Punk. It's like they're not like super deep cuts. If you had a Punk phase in high school, you'd probably pick up on them. But anyway, Hobie Brown in the 616 universe is a Spider-Man villain called the Prowler. But in this universe, he became Spider-Man. He got bitten by the spider. And I don't remember how Peter Parker, if or when he shows up in this storyline. So Spider-Punk was in the Spider-Verse storyline too. So Earth 138 is a reference to the Misfits song We Are 138. There's also... Oh yeah, Justin Mason, who I'd not seen anything before, is really good. Craven is a Nazi skinhead. There's all kinds of good punk stuff going on. And as an avowed punk rocker, as well as comic book nerd, whenever I can combine these two, Nazi punks can fuck off is a Dead Kennedys reference. It's great, and the art is perfect. It's very, like, kind of Stocco-y. James Stocco is a indie artist who has a very similar style. I'm trying to be less opaque in all my trying to be more transparent with all this jargon and stuff. There's one more. I think the Taskmaster has a devil lock. It's great stuff. There was one in particular that I really liked. One reference. Oh yeah, there it is. Well, I'll show. So this is the final. This is the Taskmaster with a devil lock. Again, another Misfits reference, and he's saying, "If you want to scream, scream with me," which is the opening lyrics to Hybrid Moments by the Misfits. And then here you got SpiderPunk, and here's this friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. That's what FNSM stands for. But in punk, what's the word? Symbology. This is a hardcore X. So you have your X, and then you, like, I'm from San Diego, so it would say SDHC. That was one of the first punk things I learned to draw on my book covers on my textbooks. Draw an X. The first time I ever saw it was for the Gainesville scene. It said GVHC, and I figured out, like, oh. And I didn't know what the difference between hardcore and punk was, or if there was one, but I found out. So this was a real fun trip for me, obviously. Okay, that's a half an hour. That's enough. Have a nice day.